Oh, we got the right message here. Please do not hesitate to ask. I want to make sure that this is as interactive as possible because my goal for this is for you to have a really clear understanding of this topic area by the end of today. And so that may mean asking questions about performance management in general, or how it relates to what you're doing. So please feel free to stop, interrupt, ask all the questions you want. We will have time at the end, but I am more than happy to pause and have any conversation or any questions during it as well. And I'll also ask a few questions along the way to get everyone chatting. You're more than welcome to come off camera or come off mute, come off camera, or you can just put it in the chat too, whatever you're comfortable with, or you can just observe as well, because I am more than happy to fill the space, but I just want to make sure that I have the opportunity to hear anything and everything that you all would like to share as well today. So as we hop into this, we are going to be, as you can see, talking about minimizing bias in performance management. The reason we are doing this is because research from so many different fields, so many different areas, from social, neurological, behavioral sciences, they've all shown that as humans, we are biologically conditioned to have a bias. So this is one of those things that is just innate in us. And we're not saying that these biases are wrong. I think that's one of the preconceived notions I want to put out there from the beginning, is that, you know, by talking about this, we're not saying it's a issue or a concern or a problem within you. This is just something we all have. And so I want us to be really open to thinking about that. What we want to make sure, and why we talk about this, is because we want to ensure that while we do have these bias, we don't want them to creep into certain aspects of our job, because it can have long-term effects. And it can, especially when we're thinking about it from a performance management perspective. So that's kind of just why this is important to have these conversations and why we talk about them. And that was a really long intro that I probably could have done most of it on the agenda before I even took the time to introduce myself. But I am Liz Culhane. I work with the Leading Edge team as their dedicated people scientist, which is in all things from survey development to results to doing master classes like this. So as Dana said, yes, we feel very much like colleagues at this point. We get to interact together. And so I'm really happy to be here and partner with you. My background is in industrial organizational psychology, and I have been in this field for a little over 15 years, with the majority of my time working at the Department of Defense, specifically on their climate survey as well. So I kind of highlighted why it's so important and what we're going to be doing today, but here is an official agenda that walks us through exactly what we're going to do. And I think the first thing that we'll start with is just really understanding the basics. Just getting us all in the same field, the same playing field. So when we're using verbiage, everyone is using it in the same way, and we have a really clear understanding. And then we're going to hop into the impact of bias and why it's such a high stakes area, specifically for this performance management component. And then the bulk of today's content is really fun because we get to actually go in and talk about different biases and give examples and maybe think about ways that it has been either something that we have personally done or maybe something that we've experienced. And so maybe we can relate a little bit more to why this happens. So we can go ahead and get started by hopping into, again, just understanding the basics. So hopping right into this is a really fun, crazy looking map, right? That shows a lot of different areas. But when we think about this, this kind of shows us why it's important to understand what we mean by bias, right? So we'll start by saying, first of all, I am biased. All humans are biased, as I was mentioning. And if you're not yet convinced that that's true, there was actually a Nobel Peace Prize that was given for groundbreaking research into how bias comes into play in economics. So this is the research that Kahneman has demonstrated. And it's just essentially saying the vast majority of human decisions we make are based on biases, beliefs, and intuition. So we may think that we base our decisions on facts or logic, but as humans, that's actually not what we make a lot of our decisions on. So this is part of why people tend to bring bias into the performance review process, even if they're going into it with the best of intentions. So when I'm saying this word bias over and over and over again, just so you know what I'm meaning here, this is what we're saying: an error in judgment that happens when a person's conscious or unconscious prejudice affect their evaluation of another person or even another group. So again, this is going to have really serious and complicated implications for high-stake decisions. This can be, think about it from a hiring perspective. Think about it from a promotion perspective. Think about it from how these performance reviews will impact those promotion decisions. And then it can even be thinking about it in who gets opportunities such as learning and development or training opportunities. So really it's those things that can be impacted across the organization. And if you haven't seen this infographic before, which I'm sure many people are not familiar with it, I was not until I started looking at this course either. But this is what we call the Cognitive Bias Codex. And it's a visual of all the different cognitive bias that we're currently aware of. So it's showing you here at the broader level and then the little specifics. And again, we can share these slides out after if you want to read all of them. But the point of why we have this in here is really to highlight how vastly common this is. This is how many bias actually exist that we're aware of. So there are many, 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 which means we use them. And one of the ways that we talk about how we can do this and why we do this bias is because it allows us to take shortcuts, right? It allows us to make decisions more quickly. So again, it's not always in that, sense that we're saying it is a negative. It's just that's how we make those. And so an example of that here we have is the IKEA effect. And so this one is one we talk a lot about, that if it's something that you personally have put your value into and you have helped create something, you have this emotional connection to it. And so you're more tied to it. So again, this is just showing one of the things that we talk about in understanding our bias from a personal perspective again. And so when we know now what the word bias is, and we know how it can be related to so many different areas of it, let's think about it in terms of numbers, right? So we keep saying it's going to have this impact, but what is really the impact of implementing this and having this bias within us without being aware of it and not thinking about certain biases? So here are some of the numbers that go around that to support it. So bias can alter the perception of objectivity and fairness in an organization. And this again is going to have a negative impact on, and can have a negative impact on employee productivity. It could have a negative impact on their engagement and their well-being. So these are the 3 areas that we pulled here from Deloitte, that they released this 2019 report on inclusion. And they were able to give these direct insights into how employee experience bias and the impact that it actually has on the organization. So you can see here, 68% of the respondents reported that bias had a negative effect on their productivity. And this is from the employee perspective. 70% report that bias they experienced negatively impacted their engagement. And as leaders, why should we care? Well, if we think about that from an engagement perspective, we know that there's a very strong correlation between engagement and turnover. So as engagement increases 1%, your turnover decreases by 0.7. So as leaders, when we're trying to retain our employees, you can think about this relationship as well. And then lastly, you can see 84% said bias negatively affected their happiness, confidence, and well-being. And when we think about bias in terms of performance management, oftentimes the stakes are even higher than these particular areas. So to understand the implications of bias in performance reviews, you have to first consider what most organizations use for performance data. They're responsible for driving decisions. It's going to be around hiring. It's going to be around promotions. It's going to be around firing. And ultimately, it may be around compensation as well. So when we think about all the different areas that are impacted. So when you as leaders are giving a performance review for an employee, you're having a very direct impact on their career and where it's going, right? So there's that direct relationship. So it's fair to say that given the weight of this kind of influence that a performance review is going to have, It's the responsibility of leaders then to make sure that they review and give a fair and objective performance as possible, right? As possible, because some of this is going to be at the unconscious level, which is why we're having this conversation today. So when we think about this, what we really, really want in this type of system is one that gives our top performers that are being recognized so that they are given opportunities to advance, right? Their skills. And we want low performers are giving advice and motivation to improve their performance, right? So you're having a performance system that works well. That's what we're hoping for. The problem is, in a recent study, it found that 9 in 10 HR leaders don't believe that annual performance reviews do actually result in accurate information, right? So that's a large amount of people that believe this is not actually happening in a correct time. And as organizations start to move towards these more human-centered performance management systems, the emphasis around development, the emphasis around growth really, really has an impact on bias, and it affects the fairness and the integrity of these approaches, as well as the impact of the overall business and the talent outcomes. So organizations really need to ensure that they're mitigating these bias to build an ability where these behaviors and these decisions are rooted in the facts that we're talking about, as opposed to the intuition or beliefs. And so going into some of the common biases in performance and some of the beliefs that we have, I think which will be really helpful is to talk about not only what are they, but how do we minimize them, right? Because we could go on and provide you a list of, go through that wheel and say, here's the 100 different biases that we have pulled up here today. But it's not really helpful if we can't think about what do we do in the workplace about this bias, and how do we do something about it as leaders, right? So if we think about this, I'm going to show you 4 different pieces of feedback in just a moment. And I want you to take a moment to read each one. And then if you want, pop into the chat, or you can come off camera if you'd like, and see if there is anything that you spot about the type of feedback that's given. So I'll give you a minute or 2 to read this, and then please share any thoughts around the feedback that you're reading. Does anyone have any thoughts or themes? So none of the feedback is specific enough to be helpful, okay? It's not really actionable, right? Too vague. Fairly generic, yeah. Too basic, nothing measurable. Okay, perfect. You might also notice, if you look at the gender, that within this, there's a difference between the type of feedback that males and females receive. And this is consistent with the research that we found not only at Qualtrics, but at other organizations as well, which shows the quality of feedback written about men and women typically differs. So this brings us to our first bias. So men, we typically find, often receive more positive feedback than women, but what's even more crucial than that is they tend to receive more specific and work-based feedback. So that's really where that difference is occurring, where women, on the other hand, while they're receiving more vague feedback, it tends to be more personality-based. And this is a trend that we see consistently over and over. And when this gender bias creeps into the feedback exchange, it can leave women feeling like they have unequal access to that constructive feedback that they really want. So receiving feedback is something that, as humans within the organization, when we're trying to grow, we need. And as you all mentioned, if it's not measurable, if it's not actionable, if it's too basic, it makes it really challenging. And if we're providing feedback, as you can imagine, based on personality, this isn't something we can necessarily change. So if women and men are being described and measured with different filters, as you can imagine, then the impact is much more further reaching than this. Not only does it create an environment where gender impacts treatment, but the feedback itself gives women and men that unequal opportunity to grow. And so here's some actual research that kind of backs what we're talking about here. And this is with our specific research here at Culture Amp. And you can see that there's a difference in the type of feedback received between men and women. And these also vary by field. So for example, in engineering, feedback gap between males and females is 13%, with men receiving 66% of the work-related feedback, while women receive 53%. So what leads to this gender bias, and how can we overcome it, right? So now we're aware of it, but what do we actually do about it? How do we overcome it to ensure that we're giving good behavioral work-related feedback regardless of gender? So for gender bias, one of the biggest culprits that we have found is that when it's unstructured feedback, it tends to have a more sway towards that gender bias. So unstructured feedback allows bias to creep in without the defined criteria wrapped around it. People will redefine what the criteria for success looks like in their head. They're probably unaware that this is even happening. But when we're asking them if someone's successful in that role, it may be different for what they perceive success to look like. So our recommendation to overcome this is to give managers structured criteria for feedback. So in other words, offer a fill in the blank, like the example we have up here on your feedback forms. And it really puts the emphasis here then on the behaviors or the accomplishments of the employee and not on their personalities. So the more structure there is, the less likely it is for your managers to fall into a trap of gender bias or really other types of bias as well. So one of the ways that I think was really helpful and what I saw in the chat a lot as well is about it not being actionable. So one of the ways that we think about it here at Culture Amp and one of the models we use, which there are many you can choose from, but the one that we use is the SBI model, which frames feedback around the situation, the behavior, and then the impact. So we ask you to talk about what was that situation, what did the behavior look like, and what was the impact of that behavior. And again, this really provides that feedback to be more meaningful, but also it's crucial in it being actionable. Because we have those actual points in there, people can take that feedback and take action to the next site as well. Also, a reminder, gender bias obviously can have a huge impact on the experience and assessments of, for example, groups of non-binary and or transgender people as well. So although these biases may manifest themselves slightly different in this manner, it is important to stay alert and keep our I'm aware of this as well. So don't want to group it all into one gender bias, but do want to just suggest and point out that there's that overlap as well. Another bias that tends to populate a lot and show up in performance management, in all of the years that I have done performance management and worked with clients, I think this is actually the biggest bias I see, especially in very well-liked leaders, right? They tend to have a leniency bias because maybe they don't want to have those harder conversations. And when I refer to lenience bias, this occurs when managers give everyone favorable ratings, even though there are clearly some employees that have opportunity for improvement, right? But just as a person, you know, maybe you're more favorable, you see things more positively, you tend to rate things higher. And so I think this is a really easy one to fall into, especially if you have a group where you are all close and you enjoy working together and there's good working relationships. It's really easy for this one to emerge. And you know, face level, like, it probably doesn't sound that bad, right? You're like, well, this doesn't sound like the worst bias, but there could be a lot worse things happening in the organization, and rating your employees favorable. But what happens is it really does weaken the objectivity of your data. So, because the truth is, there are some performers, there are some employees that are going to outperform others, even if you really, really like them. But when you mark everyone as a 4 out of 5, for example, on a rating scale, it really becomes truly challenging to differentiate between who your top performers are, especially when your group, for example, is going to be aggregated to the overall organization. And let's say only a small number of top performers in each group are going to be able to get recognized. it really gets it hard to differentiate it. And it makes it really impossible to define who deserves a promotion. Because then when leaders come to you and they're like, all 10 of your employees are 4 out of 5, you all have these great performers, we don't know who to give a promotion to. And then at that point, it really becomes not backed by the performance management system on who's available. It could lose the opportunity for your employees to receive promotions because they can't promote everyone. So as you can see, again, at the surface, it probably doesn't look like a horrible bias to have, but you can see how it could have ramifications within the organization. So when we think about how might this, play out in practice, here is an example of Jamie and Maria. So we have these 2 employees. They're both managed by the same person. The employee on the left, who we call Jamie, consistently produces above average quality work. She meets the expectations. She goes above her. She's meeting the expectations set for a role. So while it's not bad, they really go above and beyond what is asked for her. But on the other hand, we have Maria, right? And she's consistently on top of performing employees. She's taking on responsibility. She's going that extra mile. She's always willing to help folks out. But despite these differences, their manager gave them the same rating of above average on their performance review. So as a result, Jamie and Maria stay on the similar career trajectories. And while, again, at the surface level, this may look great, Maria is starting to wonder, why am I going above and beyond? Why am I doing this extra work if I am being rewarded the same as Jamie? And that can become very demotivating. It can make them feel like, am I not being recognized? Are people not realizing that I'm going above and beyond? And this can really, really start to lead to burnout for Maria. And she's like, well, you know what? I'm not even going to try anymore. So then you have this over top performer who now could ultimately end up being one of the underperformers because she is demotivated. She has burnout. So I'm going to pause for just a sec, because I know I've been talking at like 20 minutes. But does this sound familiar to anyone? Gender bias, leniency bias, anything that folks have experienced or seen in organizations? It doesn't even have to be in this current organization. Okay, I see head nodding. Yes, okay. Perfect. And again, feel free. I have the chat open, but I'm not always looking on my other computer screen. So please feel free to come off at any point.
Liz, I was going to say, and I know you'll get to this, that these often build on each other too. I've seen in particular some leniency bias when people are managing across lines of difference, where people might have a reticence to provide direct feedback because of their own discomfort for any number of reasons. So just naming as we go through that these often kind of show up in a layered way. And it's good to kind of decouple them where possible and think about why and how those things are potentially showing up.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great call out. And I think you're 100% right. They probably don't always operate in a silo, but maybe the rationale or the reason behind why they're happening does. So it is really important to think about, when we want to do something about it, what does it look like? And how do we address each of those separately? So that's kind of perfect timing on one of the ways that we can minimize the leniency bias. And this one's actually really simple and really effective to overcome leniency bias. So this is one that just involves adjusting your rating scale. So when we looked at this here at Culture Gap, we have a whole team of data scientists that don't necessarily work with a customer like myself, but actually dig into the data, who look at this, who look at all the performance reviews and dig behind all the research that we then present to the customers. And they actually looked at over 150 different performance review cycles across different organizations. And they found that when they're doing this to reduce the leniency bias, this one here on the bottom, that 4.1, is actually the best choice. And there's a few reasons. First, because having 2 options for high performance minimizes that bias. So as you can see, it's not just the one here. We have 2 areas that are above, right? So on that 4-point scale, you'll notice that the scales aren't equally weighted between high and low performance options, as maybe you would typically expect to see in a scale. And this minimizes leniency bias by providing more options and the differentiation on the higher end of the performance scale. So it really allows you to think about them into chunks instead of on a continuous So we kind of think of them more on a continuum before, where we can think about these and we can think about like those folks that really, really meet expectations, those that go above them, and those that are really setting a new standard, something outside of what we typically think. So if we think back to the example we just went through with the scale, the manager could mark someone like Jamie as consistently meeting expectations, or even often exceeds expectations, and still giving them really positive feedback in those conversations. While someone like Maria could be setting a new standard because they're going above and beyond. They're taking on more than their actual role is. And so this really allows us to provide them with more objective data and recognize the hard work for those performers. The second reason that we really see this 4-point scale being the best option is because removing that middle option, that average, that 3 out of the 5, eliminates another bias, which is called the central tendency bias, which is just our thing to go like right down the middle and put everything in the middle. So in our research, we found that the 5-point rating scales are okay, but if you want to use 2 ratings to further differentiate per performance, this still could mean that there's no neutral. So if you wanted to do like add in, for example, another one here, we just always suggest if you want to keep it at the 5-point, you don't have this neutral area or this average, because again, it will push you into that central tendency. So we move from one bias to the others. It's also important to note that anchors are equally important as the number. So we recommend avoiding anchors like neutral or average or normal, because it's really difficult to define and assess. But we found things like middle ground or neutral weighting impacted the spread of the scores. We also recommend that you avoid referencing to compensation in a performance or to increase. So this often distorts. So when you start putting money or promotional opportunities on the ratings, that can also go towards the leniency effect as well. So when we think about this, again, we have the 4, the needs development, consistently meets expectations, etc. But on top of that, we also recommend adding your own description underneath these against each of the points of the scale to really help managers accurately differentiate performance. So for example, you could put needs development, and then at the top of the performance, a line or 2 about what that means. Consistently meets expectations with an explanation, so that everyone that's completing this is on the same page and not only using that scale to avoid it, but also to ensure that they're on the same understanding of what we're saying with that as well. So here, another exercise to just kind of think about. So if you take a moment and think about a person in your team, or it could be a colleague, or technically really it could even be a manager. Get them clear in your mind and think about something that they did that was really helpful to you. And think about what they did, what that situation was, and what about it was helpful. So we're thinking about it. So now I'm going to ask you, of that situation that you were just thinking about in your head, and you can put this in the chat. Did it happen a week ago? Did it happen a month ago? Did it happen 3 months ago? Did it happen 6 months ago? So if you want to just put in the chat, or you can come off mute and think about that situation you had in mind. When did it happen? Last Friday. I don't need anyone else to even answer at this point, because that's like the perfect response to go into the next bias. But I love this one. 3 weeks ago, it's perfect. Last week, perfect. My point was, what demonstrated and what's probably happening, it was recent, right? So no one is, oh, someone put in here a year ago. You just broke the bias that I was thinking. No one ever puts more than 3 months. But I like that it's continually ongoing. One of the bias that happens a lot in performance is recency bias. And so when we're doing performance evaluations, Again, you could be evaluating someone's performance over the past 6 months, or sometimes it could even be over the past year. So maybe you just have an annual performance review. What happens is in our brains, and what typically we will do is, as a leader, we will think about what happened the past 2 to 4 weeks. That's just consistently what we find in the research. That's what the science says. That's we think back to the past few weeks of what's happening. So let's imagine, let's even say it's every 6 months and not annual. Let's say you have biennial. So you are literally missing 5 out of the 6 months if you're on a good end of that 4 weeks. So it's really natural for us to focus on those most recent behaviors and accomplishments because they're freshest in our memory, right? They just happened. But what this can do is it can negatively impact your data since it doesn't actually provide that holistic view, right? So we're not getting those full 6 months or those full 12 months of that employee's performance. And it's not just managers that do this. It's not just leaders that do it. The person evaluating does this as well. So if you look at self-evaluations, we typically tend to fill them out based on what we've done in the past 30 days. So we see this from both perspectives as well. So this is really where the Academy Award bias. I so agree with that. And I even think about that when I'm watching the Academy Awards because I don't remember movies I've seen before that either. So I do. I think that is such a good bias. And I feel like I'm going to use that next time I teach this class because I love that as an example. But yeah, it definitely happens where it's what we're thinking about. And we do it from leadership levels. We do it from a personal level. It's just how our brains operate. We think about that even too, this is kind of getting off track, but when you gave the Academy Award, when I first learned about this concept years ago in grad school, it was used in the courtroom example of, whether the prosecutor or the defense goes last and how that impacts the jury's decision, So again, there's even examples like that we have looked at outside of the work. But with the recency bias, this is an example. Again, we have Maria at the beginning of the year. She landed this huge deal for the company. It received a ton of recognition. Her peers, everyone's excited. The last 2 months, her performance has slipped. She missed a deadline. So Maria's evaluation is going to unfortunately be low, right? Because we're not going to remember what she did that was so great 6 months ago. And her manager is only going to focus on those recent events. And you can see that the impact then will have been omitted, these huge things that have happened previously in the year, which I think we can all see that why this is important and kind of walk through this example here. And so to limit the impact of this, exactly what we're seeing in here of documentation, right? So it's really, really important for us to encourage our managers to develop habits of collecting feedback along the way of their employees throughout the year. So putting them together in this profile, this performance snapshot, making this. So essentially at the end of those 6 months, they'll have a real clear picture of what that that individual has done for the organization. And so here is one of those profiles. You can create these in any systems. There's lots of ways that you can do this. Think about it from your performance management system, which ways you have to do this. But essentially what is ideal is to create the profile, and it can be accessed directly from hopefully your platform, where then when you go to do that performance evaluation, you can go back and see what's happened over the last 6 months or the last 12 months. And so that all of that can be considered prior to then completing the performance review. So you're taking it into consideration. Again, this is going to mitigate more than just the recency bias. There's the primacy bias, which tends to emphasize information that we learned early on. So maybe you're a leader of 30 different people. You meet Maria at the beginning of it, you have an opinion immediately, and then you don't work directly with her, even though you oversee her. You're overseeing a lot of folks. So when you go to do her performance evaluations, you're doing them based on when you initially met her. This is the primacy bias. So again, there's a lot of things that are really helpful in being able to collect this data or create these types of profiles throughout the year so that, again, you can reference them back when we get to them. which hopefully a lot of this is like, oh yeah, we should be doing this. This makes sense. It's not like brain surgery. This isn't like groundbreaking things. It's just those things we probably don't think about of why it's so important to do it as well. One of the ones, we used to actually not even really talk about this so much, but it's becoming more and more common following COVID and people working from home, not working from home. And this is that shift to folks being in remote or hybrid environments, and that's the proximity bias. And this is when managers tend to place a higher value on the work that they physically see someone doing in the office, while discounting work that is maybe being done out of sight. So they're not seeing you do this. And this can impact folks in disproportionately, like, for example, your remote workers. So again, we know that things like goals could help mitigate this by giving you a clear, yardstick. How do we compare this employee to this employee or overall performance? But this is really helpful, particularly in hybrid teams, to make sure that we have these really clear goals, so that we can make sure our direct reports, even though they may be co-located, that we're evaluating them on the same fairness, the same objectivity. So an example here of how this could potentially play out, excuse me, is Noor, who, as you can see, manages both Jamie and Maria. So our friends that we keep seeing throughout this presentation, they keep coming up, right? Maria is really thriving on being in an office environment and goes to the office every day. That's what she prefers to do. She sits in close proximity to Noor. She is there, they see each other. Jamie tends to find that working from home is more productive, that he is able to do this. It's a better situation for his family, and he's making use of the company's policy, right? So both of them get to choose wherever they want to be. They're working what works best for them. But for Maria, it is much easier, as you can imagine, to attract the attention of sitting across from her manager, who is consistently seeing her. And so it becomes more top of mind for Noor, for example, when thinking about promotions. And again, imagine that we don't have any background on them, and all we know is this information. So in turn, Noor would be perceiving Jamie's performance lower just because he's not physically present. And she can't see the work he's doing, even though maybe in his remote environment, he's maybe doing more work in this situation. So again, you can start to see and understand how this becomes, that lack of visibility can often be one of those things you're not even aware of. It's out of sight, out of mind. It's kind of that common saying that we hear over and over, and that's exactly what we're seeing here in this proximity bias. So one of the really easy ways that we can overcome this is that business leaders need to, what we have to start doing is we have to learn things, we have to unlearn things, then we have to relearn things. And we have to do that with the environment and the fact that the way in which people are working is going to continue to change. And as we've seen, the move towards more remote working is already forcing leaders to shift their mindset around what productivity looks like. What can folks do in a remote environment? So like many other things, this requires actual realization, careful thoughts, preparing, thinking about all these. So we, again, always are going to have to be able to shift our mindsets. But the trick to mitigating against proximity bias, again, falls to gathering constructive developmental feedback, and it can be from other folks as well. Okay, so if you don't work in close proximity to your direct reports, for example, on a daily basis, you can seek feedback from the colleagues that do. Seek feedback from those folks that they do work directly with. And gathering feedback on that work might not be immediately visible to you, but it really can provide those valuable insights. So again, you can think about this even if you're managing many, many people and you're not seeing where that work is. Ask their colleagues how they're doing. How is that team project doing? What are their strengths? What are their opportunities? Again, just thinking about ways that we can gather that feedback if we aren't able to see it as the work changes, especially as you continue to have maybe more and more workers that you're not directly seeing. And then many of you have heard this one, I'm sure, many times. It's really common when it comes to interactions at work particularly around performance management, is the halo effect is probably the more common one. But there's also the horn effect, which is really the tendency to allow either one bad or one good trait to overshadow others. So for example, letting an employee's sense of humor that you don't particularly enjoy override the fact that they have amazing communication skills and working great with clients, right? So there could be one bad trait and it's allowing you to it's not allowing you to see the great things that they do at work. So when we think about this, we know that we're all humans. We all have our very own unique pet peeves. We all have our own preferences. So sometimes these quirks that other employees have that we could see could overshadow our ability to assess them as people overall, particularly, of course, in the workplace. So for example, when we think about this is the bias of why attractive people are much more likely to be rated as trustworthy. And at the same time, if or when an attractive person fails to live up to those higher expectations, they also suffer a penalty for not living up to the presumptions more so. So you can see how this goes both ways as well. So again, using the same folks here, let's use Nora, Jamie, and Maria once again to think about this. So Nora may have a soft spot for proactive, outspoken individuals. And we know that Jamie is very outgoing, gregarious, while Maria tends to be more quiet and withdrawn during meetings. So Nora may end up giving Maria a lower score, even though they offer other valuable qualities and contributions. So again, you're leaning towards that one particular trait and rating them based upon that. So when we think about how do we really like dampen or minimize the effects here of the halo or horn bias, evaluating performance on multiple dimensions is really helpful instead of leaving it open to interpretation. So for example, are you rating individual achievement, but failing to look at the way people contribute to the success of others? So for example, many organizations work to evaluate whether employees are living their values in their performance process, not just looking at what employees achieve, but how they achieve them. So to get a holistic view, you can assess at least 2 to 3 different aspects of performance so that one awesome or one maybe what you would perceive as a miserable trait doesn't overshadow everything else here as well. And yes, oh my gosh, Dana, that's perfect timing, because the more objective measure, it's like, you couldn't have set it better up into exactly what we were going into. So the more objective measure can also help combat the similar to me bias, which is exactly what it sounds like, right? So it's the inclination to give a higher rating to people with similar interests, skills, or backgrounds as yourself. So in a really simple way to say it, we tend to like people that are like us, right? So if you're very similar to me, I am probably going to like you more so. So in addition to making performance reviews tricky, similar to me bias can also have a bigger impact of making your workplace feel less inclusive, right? So we start to see this trickle down and how it has effects into other parts of the organization, particularly if what Dana was talking about with hiring and firing decisions, right? If they're based on people we deem being similar to ourselves, you can see how this could quickly create a culture that lacks diversity. So if I am in charge of all the hiring and I only hire people that are like me, we're not going to have as much diversity in the organization that we need to have, right? And this is going to have major complications and implications for the organization. And again, we think about how you can bring questions into the review process that focus once again on decisions, on intentions. So we've got to think about these a little bit deeper here to ensure that we don't continue to do this. So here you can see, again, this is an example of a manager, but again, you can see it in hiring decisions, firing, but here it's a manager and he is doing an evaluation and in conversations realizes that the very highly rated top ranked school that he went to, that he values as being the best of the best, one of his employees went to. So immediately, regardless of how her performance has actually been, he's like, well, we went to the same school, it's top ranked, there's absolutely no way she couldn't be a top performer who is overperforming and overachiever. And so it's quickly to give her a high rating as opposed to looking objectively at her performance as well. And you can reduce this similar to me bias by requiring specificity when we're really looking at it, particularly in this manager assessment here. So Yale researchers are one of the ones that are the top in looking at this. And they found that when you first agree to criteria, use an assessment, and then you make the evaluation after, you're less likely to rely on things such as your stereotypes, or the assessments are essentially less biased. So in this example, the manager evaluation question asks how the person has progressed over the past 6 months, but the description provides guidance on the specificity required in evaluating that employee against the question. So it really leaves it less open to interpretation here. Okay, so what we want again, making it more and more specific, which as you can see is starting to kind of be a trend in some of these bias conversations we're having. And the last one I want to just dive into before we open it up to questions or conversations is the law of small number bias. And the law of small number bias is the incorrect belief that a small sample closely shares the properties of the underlying population. So for an example, imagine that there's an amazing team. It is full of top performers. One of those top members is doing the work of 4 members. So naturally, you rate that person as higher than the rest, and all of the other folks below that person as a little bit lower. However, it turns out that even the lowest performer on your team is among the best in the whole company. And so when it comes time to look at performance company-wide, it appears that you have a team that's just average, even though there may be, and it appears here, that there's exceptional people on your team as well. So how do you overcome this law of small number bias, which is a little bit more specific? The most important thing here is to ensure that managers calibrate their own perceptions against other managers. So when I'm saying the word calibration, this is a process that aims to make reviews fair and consistent across managers at all levels, at all departments, and even at different job levels. So it does take a little bit of a legwork. This isn't just an easy thing to do that just happens overnight. There's a lot of work that goes into this from the HR team, from the managers, and working on those calibrations, but it really can help improve accountability of your reviews and ensure that everyone is receiving feedback that's both fair and designed to support the growth of the company, right? So performance review calibration process is one in which, for example, the managers discuss their proposed employee ratings with other managers. And essentially here, the goal is to find common ground that makes consistent employee performance evaluations possible. So it's meant to limit bias of performance and ensure managers agree on the criteria against their direct reports. So for example, if I'm rating someone a 4 and Dana's rating someone a 4, when we discuss what that looks like, it looks the same. And if it's not, we start to bring in conversations to make sure that when someone is a 4, it means the same thing. So within calibrations, your manager should seek out information that goes against what they already believe about their employee, right? So it's continually taking in as much information as you can. And you want to speak about the feedback. You want to speak about the all of the aspects of the employee to really give that overall. So, again, this is an example of thinking about it. A more laid back manager might be more inclined to give every employee on their team a 5 because their employees did everything listed in the job description during the job cycle. And they're like, okay, well, everyone did what they were supposed to do. I'm going to give everyone a 5. But on the other hand, a manager may have a really high performing team So everyone that did everything that they were supposed to do for their team got a 3. And again, so the point is to have those two managers have the conversation to make sure that we can be calibrated across the organizations. I see comments in here, so we will go to those in a minute. So I know we've gone through a lot. I know that many of them are common bias that have impacted performance management systems, and we've talked about how to minimize and avoid them. Some of these might be ones that you personally have experienced. Maybe it's ones that you're like, oh, it's by chance I do that too. I wasn't aware, right? Ultimately, I think as we walk through this and we think about when we walk away from what we did today, we know that we all are biased, but what can we do about this? And again, I think the one thing we can think about is using the science-backed design to help overcome bias and promote fairness. This was kind of the underlying thing that we were talking about consistently that was helpful across multiple bias, is having, you know, this structure, having the specifics, having the actionable, you know, focusing on the behaviors, not the personality. Because despite many companies who roll out unconscious bias training to their staff, we know that being aware of bias and even overcoming it is rarely effective if we don't have a tool put in place to do it. So it's not just being aware of it, it's having a solution or a way to work around it. And, you know, I think as we rebuild this approach, we're going to find that we just have to keep reviewing it and we have to practice it. And there's going to be new blockers that come up. I mean, if we think about this proximity bias, this wasn't necessarily a huge issue until a couple years ago. So again, we have to just keep learning, we have to keep adjusting, we have to keep practicing what works for our managers. And then we have to remember too, and not put so much pressure. We have to hold ourselves accountable, but we also have to be aware that we're never going to be completely free of bias. Okay, so it's encouraging to know that we have the ability to improve ourselves. It is upon us to be able to do it. We can keep reviewing this. We can keep practicing these. But we also have to allow ourselves to be human and recognize that there are limits of our own understanding. You know, we went through a few of the bias today, but we can't expect everyone to know every single bias and be aware of how to overcome all of them. I think it's just one of those things where we just keep learning and we keep trying to improve ourselves as we do this. And we know that there's going to be systems, process, procedures, even technology that will continue to evolve and develop that will allow us to make better decisions. But I think one of the other things we can always do as well is, you know, ask for help, get feedback from others, ask other leaders what they're doing to reduce this. What do they keep in mind? What have they found that works from them as well? Because every organization is a little bit different. The performance systems you use might be a little bit different. So again, just keep learning from one another and asking for that as well. And so we won't do this exercise because we are at 4 minutes, but just thinking about it in your head, you know, think about one that you learned about today that you'd love to take back to your organization and try to tackle, or think about when you do your next performance reviews. You know, and it could be from gender to recency, proximity, central tendencies, leniency bias, any of the ones we talked about today. So hopefully there's one that resonated that can be a goal to work on for you personally. So I'm going to pause. I'm going to open it up to see if there are any questions before we wrap up, and also make sure I go to the chat to follow in on anything I missed.
Yeah, Liz, while you look through that, I did have one thought, Shira, if you're still around. I don't have an immediate solution to what you were raising, because I realize there's, you know, some nuance for different contexts. But one thing I will offer is that I do think what that bias is trying to kind of prevent is to get kind of multiple perspectives on someone's performance. Like, that's the heart of it. And so one thing you all might consider, if it's not something you're currently doing, is doing opportunities for peer feedback and just different opportunities kind of along the way, whether it's part of your formal performance review process or at one point during the year. Like, we just did this for one of our quarterly check-ins. So it just gives a different point of view on someone and helps to minimize some of the other biases, even if ultimately, like, you just have, the manager who's going to oversee the merit increase or review. So I do want to offer that suggestion to the extent that it's helpful. And we've used a kind of quick, like 2x2 format, which I've linked in other spaces, and I'll drop it in here in a second. And like the feedback that I got from my peer is really different, honestly, than what I get from my manager, because we have very different working styles, and I found it to be valuable.
Well, thank you all for joining. If you think of any questions, please don't hesitate to ask. The conversation doesn't have to stop. So you can email me, you can ask Dana. I'm happy to talk further about any of them or talk about ones that we didn't talk about today. We just kind of cherry pick a few to talk about, but I'm happy to hop into any other conversation around this. And I really do appreciate you taking the time to join today.
Great. Thanks, Liz, and thank you all for being here. We'll send a note out with all of the content that Liz covered today, and I hope that everybody has a good week.
Thank you.
Hi, Tony.